Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Alder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 18 years of law enforcement analysis experience. He was an analyst in Newark, New Jersey, and Rutgers School of Criminal Justice before becoming a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He's here to talk about his career, key performance indicators, and his new book, Modern Policing Using ArcGIS Pro. Please welcome Eric Piza. Eric, how are we doing?
I'm doing all right, Jason. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining me. How did you discover the law enforcement analysis profession?
So all credit is due to one of my undergraduate professors. Most people will know him as the co-author of the broken windows theory, George Kelling. So essentially, when I was an undergraduate student at Rutgers University, I was interested in criminal justice, but I didn't want to become a police officer. So essentially, that leaves one option, right? For people who don't kind of know the nuances of the field, that meant I had my eyes on going to law school and being a lawyer, right? Because again, criminal justice, don't want to be a cop. What else is there? So one day I'm kind of wandering around the Rutgers Newark campus. I see a flyer for, kind of an intern position at one of the campus research centers headed up by George Kelling. I figured I have gaps between classes, may as well make a couple dollars. So I apply, I get it. And then once there, I actually see that the work of the research center involved academics communicating with community partners. Also, law enforcement would come to these regular crime prevention meetings that the research center would host at Rutgers University. And I saw the role that analysis and data played in real world activities revolving around crime prevention and community safety. And I had no idea that world existed, right? Like I had no idea that there was a role for academic research, for lack of a better term, or crime analysis, which is probably the more appropriate term, in crime control and prevention. So that pretty much introduced me to the profession and ignited my passion for the crime analysis field.
You were there for 4 years, right?
I was in my official employment capacity at the research center. Yeah. I was at Rutgers longer because I actually got all of my degrees from Rutgers University from undergraduate through my PhD. But being attached to the research center, I think probably around 4 or 5 years.
Is there a project that sticks out when you think back?
Yes, because I think it was the one that kind of led to my crime analysis position, right? So we did a project called Operation Ceasefire, only because for some reason every fourth policing intervention needs to be named ceasefire, right? So not to be confused with the Boston ceasefire or Chicago ceasefire projects. We did a project in New York called Operation Ceasefire, community policing intervention that paired a new shooting investigative team with some social outreach workers. We identified a target area that kind of overlaps Newark, New Jersey, and a neighboring town called Irvington, New Jersey. So I was the primary crime analyst employed by Rutgers. I was the primary crime analyst on that effort, right? So both police departments would send their information over to Rutgers. We would conduct analysis and then share it with our law enforcement and community partners at weekly or bi-weekly meetings. Essentially, that ultimately led to the Newark, New Jersey Police Department offering me a position to join them full time, which I obviously accepted.
As you're changing from the university to the police department, then what were some lessons learned or things you picked up pretty quick?
So some lessons learned was, one, right, I mean, how much of a need there was for data-driven analysis in day-to-day policing. So that was the first thing that kind of popped up, right? I mean, I kind of worked on this pet project is wrong way to phrase it, right? But ceasefire was kind of one intervention that required data analysis and crime analysis. But when I went to the police department, it was clear to me that a whole host of daily operations could be done maybe a little bit more effectively with strong crime analysis being linked to it. So that was kind of the first lesson. The second lesson was how challenging it can be to translate research for practice purposes, right? Understand or explaining rather what the findings of your fancy crime analysis product mean. And that's one thing, but also convincing command staff, police officers, why it's relevant for on the ground activity, right? That's something completely different, right? So being able to become a good communicator kind of was highlighted to me early in my time at the Newark Police Department, right? It wasn't enough to just do the analysis. Communicating why the analysis was important was kind of the second half that I really became alert to.
And I was going to ask you about that, because I ask almost every academic that this idea of writing and speaking in the academic setting versus the police department. There is a difference between being in a meeting in an academic setting and being in a meeting at a police department.
Exactly, right? I mean, there's different audiences, right? So when we present our work as academics to academic audiences, things like the statistical formula, sampling method, why your control group is a strong control group, that's the most important, right? Because the academics want to make sure you get the science right. In police settings, right, when you're meeting with practitioners, not to say that they're uninterested in that or that all of those things all of a sudden become unimportant, but what you have to communicate are the practical applications and what it means for the bottom line of public safety, and which is, again, something we take for granted and something that I think we need to train analysts and also certainly academics in a little bit more.
Now, did you find it easier, harder to communicate with stakeholders as a member of Rutgers versus as a member of Newark PD?
Not necessarily, right? I think as I got immersed in the police department and I understood, well, the first thing I understood was a lot of individuals in the police profession are highly intelligent, right? And we should never assume that outside academics are more intellectually advanced, right, than police leadership or even just police managers and police officers, right? So I never felt like I had to dumb down anything, right? Like I never felt like I had to explain the super basics of what I was doing as a crime analyst to any of my colleagues at the Newark Police Department. What I became to appreciate is exactly what they were looking to get out of it, right? So that wasn't terribly difficult, right? I mean, there was a bit of a learning curve, I suppose, but I don't think there was any like big difference in the difficulty in communication. I think just the way I had to go about communicating differed depending on what arena I was in, right? The university setting or as a university employee versus a police employee.
And your title when you're at Newark is Geographic Information System Specialist.
Yes.
Which I find interesting. If you would describe the difference between the GIS specialist and a crime analyst.
It's an excellent question. So my training was in GIS, right? Going through Rutgers, I was trained in crime mapping. Most of the analysis I did had its roots in GIS, and that's actually still true today. Most of my research has its roots in GIS. But as for the day-to-day work, I think it was just semantics and just the fact that the Newark Police Department opened up a civil service position that had GIS specialists on it instead of crime analysts. When you got down to the nitty gritty, I think the work I was doing in Newark was similar to the work that crime analysts do in most other police agencies.
And this brings us to your analyst badge story. And the analyst badge story is brought to you by Mindy's Quick Takes. Those are quick tip videos published the second Thursday of every month. It's an animated series. Please catch it on our YouTube channel at LA Podcasts. So Eric, as an analyst, what would you describe as your career-defining case or project?
Two come to mind, so I'm going to cheat if that's okay and kind of tell two stories here. I'll try to do them quickly. I think early on, right? I think in the first couple of years when I worked at the police department, the new police director came over and he tried to usher in new place-based policing emphasis. He wanted to move away from reactive policing towards proactive policing and problem-oriented policing. And he wanted to institute a foot patrol hotspots type of intervention, right? Where he wanted to identify a specific area of the city, take, I believe the number was between 8 and 12 of the most recent police academy graduates and assign them to foot patrol on that in that area, as opposed to sending them to in a patrol car to kind of chase the radio. So essentially, at first everyone was like, okay, we could do it in this precinct or this neighborhood. And he kept pushing back saying, no, that's too big, right? Like we need to identify really small micro level hotspots, which is at the time something that the agency hadn't spent much work doing, right? I mean, the agency defined its work at the precinct or sector level up until that point. So I was kind of able to come in with my GIS background and give a number of different options built around small micro level hotspots that constituted a street corner or a handful collection of street corners. And then we were able to identify the target area for what became known as Operation Impact, right? This was the foot patrol intervention based on the analysis that I presented. So that kind of introduced me to the agency's command staff. It kind of suggested that, again, the data had a very different implication than everyone's gut reaction was, because everyone was nominating larger neighborhoods or collections of housing projects. And the data said something pretty differently, right? So I think that was kind of a way to introduce myself to the command staff and show the importance of that type of analysis on day-to-day practice.
So how did you whittle it down to a hotspot block?
Excellent question. So the first thing I did is I took the city of Newark, and I'll try to use as little GIS jargon as possible here. But so I took the city boundary and I broke it up into equally sized 300 foot by 300 foot grids, right? So if you can imagine a city boundary that just has all of these grids in it. Then using, I believe, 5 years worth of data, I calculated the number of crimes falling within each one of the grid. I took a weighted approach where more recent crimes and crimes that involved firearms were weighted a little bit more heavily than older crimes and violent crimes that did not involve firearms. And then each grid got a score, right? Pretty much a severity score. If I was doing this analysis today, I would have called it a harm score, because kind of harm-focused policing and harm indexes in vogue right now. But anyway, so everything was weighted, and then I identified the top 10 grids in the city and then drew pretty much foot patrol boundaries around each one of the grids to give the command staff options about which one to select. All right, so that's pretty much what I did.
It's interesting. When I was at Cincinnati, I once did analysis where I did it by street segment. And
yes.
I thought, I was like, oh, this is going to turn out so well, until all the street segments weren't the same size. And I had a really, really long street segment that skewed all the data.
Yeah, certainly.
So then, well, I guess, is there anything else to that story? What was the result of that?
So the result was a targeted intervention. After a year, we conducted an evaluation, which actually later turned into my first peer-reviewed publication, actually. We evaluated the effort. We found good news and bad news. The good news was that in the target area, overall violent crime did significantly reduce as compared to a couple of control areas. The bad news was that even though there was an overall reduction of violence, armed robbery actually significantly displaced, right? So in the area immediately outside of the target area, robberies went up pretty sizably. And during the times of day where the foot patrol officers weren't on the streets, robbery also did go up pretty substantially, right? So that's essentially what we found in the research effort.
So then what was the recommendation coming out of that?
So the recommendation was, well, let me take a step back, right? So why did the displacement occur, right? And given the follow-up analyses we did, it looks like the fact that the foot patrol officers were deployed the same exact time every day. So they went out from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. to coincide with the robbery spikes, or rather the violent crime spikes. But right, the fact that they were out there every single day at the exact same time made it a little bit predictable. And it looked like the temporal displacement would happen like literally within the hour prior to or after the foot patrol officers were out there, right? We started seeing robberies at times of the day where we didn't see them earlier. And looking at the displacement, again, like kind of the spatial displacement, it happens really close to the target area in places that looked the more problematic areas within the target area, right? So housing projects, areas known as known drug markets or gang territories, those areas in the buffer zone suffered from heightened levels of displacement, right? So the recommendation was, moving forward, any type of targeted intervention like this, you should make it so that it wasn't so spatially and temporally predictable. Rather than having one target area, maybe have a couple, right? Instead of sending the cops out there the same exact time every day, maybe adjust that a little bit, right? So that was the main recommendation to the police agency.
And then your second story deals with video surveillance shortcomings, correct?
Yeah, so my second bad story, this was a little later in my time at the Newark Police Department. So essentially my first office in the agency was in the communication center. So essentially, and I kind of showed up and I think they forgot I was coming that day. So they just kind of cleaned off the desk and threw me in this one room that I shared with the video surveillance operators, right? So essentially, the video surveillance cameras around the city, all of the feeds fed into this one room, and there were a couple of police officers or civilians, depending on the tour of duty, monitoring the cameras for criminal activity, right? And I was sitting there, I would do my work, and every now and then be distracted by the fun stuff going on the video cameras. What I found pretty quickly, just from observing, is all of the benefits that we think we're getting by installing video cameras weren't translating into practice, right? So what's the benefit of putting the camera up, right? The first benefit, I think most people would say, would be that potential offenders would be too afraid of the cameras to commit crime in front of them. Well, these cameras are all in public places, and the amount of drug transactions, fights, even predatory crimes like robberies and shootings happening in close proximity to the cameras kind of quickly told me that that may not be the case. The second benefit, right, if we're putting up a camera, if a crime does happen, we would expect police to respond to that incident quickly since they're actually viewing it in real time. And again, what I found there was that just didn't happen in practice because of things like CAD systems and the differential response to to vehicle deployment, right? When these individuals would spot really troublesome events and enter the system, enter the event into our agency's CAD system, it would take 10, 20, 30 minutes for a police car to respond to that event, right? And by that time, it's over, right? And anyone paying attention can quickly realize on the street that, all right, there may be a camera there, but when a crime happens, the cops aren't getting out here any more quickly than they used to. So how risky is it really to commit crime in front of these cameras? And the honest answer is, far too often it's not very risky.
We found in Cincinnati that many of the citizens didn't believe the cameras were working or were actually recording, that they were actually just there almost as a prop.
Yeah, and if we're being honest, they may as well be, right? And I'm not picking on Newark here, right? I mean, research shows that this is the case in most places, but the amount of cameras that were installed in the city and the small number of human beings that were tasked with monitoring the cameras meant that most cameras, most of the time, weren't being actively watched. Right. So when I first started over there, there were 2 individuals assigned to monitoring cameras across all of the tours of duty. I believe there were 30 or so cameras installed. The system expanded to 146 cameras by the time I left the agency. And the video surveillance unit was still comprised of 2 people. There's no way 2 people can watch that many cameras to the level needed to actually deliver on the promise of surveillance, right? I mean, all of the benefits that we expect to get from putting cameras up, if that's your human capital, you're not going to achieve those benefits.
Did you have a recommendation then, or?
So that was the gut feeling, right? And, the gut feeling had to be supported by data, right? So essentially, I started collecting data to kind of explore these questions a little bit more empirically. I partnered with a couple of faculty members at Rutgers University, Joel Kaplan and Les Kennedy, who ended up overseeing my dissertation research. On this study, we were able to get a grant from the National Institute of Justice to do a number of studies. And essentially, the gut feelings, to make a long story short, were essentially empirically proven, where we kind of identified what we labeled as surveillance barriers as the main reason why the cameras really weren't having much of a crime prevention effect. This culminated in a strategy where we identified a small number of cameras in hotspots throughout the city. Part of the NIJ funding went toward funding an additional operator to work over one summertime looking at just those cameras. And then in addition, there were 2 unmarked patrol cars in the streets, so that when this new experimental operator saw a crime happen on camera, rather than enter the event into CAD, this person radioed the 2 unmarked police cars and they went and dealt with the incident immediately. What we saw here was that while the standalone system didn't have any impact on violent crime or crime in general, to be frankly honest, during this experiment, violent crime, disorder, and narcotics offenses all substantially and significantly decreased, right? So essentially, that was the main recommendation. We were able to communicate those benefits during this experiment. For any academics out there listening or anyone attuned to research methods, right? We did this as a randomized controlled trial. So essentially, we were able to highlight the benefits of adjusting video surveillance operations in a way that made the police practice a little bit more proactive.
Did they change? At the summer ended and the NIJ funding would have ran out. And did the policy change at Newark at all?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, both of my bad stories have sad endings. All right, so the first bad story, right, after communicating the benefits of maybe doing foot patrol differently in the future, Newark, like a lot of cities around the country, had a significant financial crunch with the economic recession, and they ended up firing about 12% of the agency. So not much proactive foot patrol happened after that. And with the video surveillance project, right, we communicated the benefits to the police director at the time, who had ideas for changing and revamping the policy. That individual left to take a position in another police agency. The next police director came in, we kind of told the same story. He had similar ideas and then retired. So essentially, we had such turnover in the police director position that the lessons of this experiment were kind of lost over time.
Because it is tough. I mean, there's a lot of real-time crime centers out there, and there are lots of cameras in every city now. You can even see the ones that have blue lights around them, right? Signifying that they're there. But to catch it in the act, it seems like it wouldn't happen too often. Do you remember how many incidences when the one person in the hotspot was surveilling it through the cameras? Do you have any kind of number as a per day, per week that they were seeing happen?
Well, in the unmarked car experiment, it happened every night, every tour of duty, right? Because we adjusted it so that it was a realistic number of cameras that were being watched during the experiment, and the patrol cars had no other responsibilities except to respond to incidents identified on the experimental cameras. So during the experiment, it happened very often. Prior to the experiment, that's the problem, right? I mean, prior to the experiment, at the beginning, there was a decent amount of proactive surveillance activity, meaning that the operators were identifying and reporting incidents on a pretty frequent basis. Over time, that activity plummeted, which is a little counterintuitive, right? Because over time, there were many more cameras installed. During interviews I did as part of that project with the surveillance operators, what I found was the operators just became frustrated with the lack of response that I described at the beginning, right? They said that, they would report individuals that, looked like they were carrying firearms. They would report things like aggressive arguments on a street corner that turned into fistfights. And since prior to the experiment, all of that had to be input into the CAD system, meaning they were competing with all of the 911 calls coming in for police response. Police wouldn't arrive, again, as I said before, for 10, 20, 30 minutes, right? So after a while, the vigilance of the operators decreased because they just didn't see the proactive benefit that they thought should be a kind of accompanying the video surveillance cameras, right? So that was a big problem that we identified.
So then you get your PhD. It sounds like you never really took off the research hat. I mean, even what you've described to me, just the last couple of stories, it seems like you still had research at heart. So it's no surprise then that you make your way back to the Rutgers School of Criminal Justice to become a research faculty member there.
Yeah, certainly, right? I mean, so the CCTV experiment, right? At the beginning of those efforts, I was doing that research as an official employee of the police department. But after I finished my PhD and transitioned, right, the latter half of all that research, I was back in academia. So when I finished my PhD, I was kind of soul searching, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I came to the conclusion that it was time for me to go into academia and to leave municipal government for a number of reasons. And I was fortunate enough to be offered a position back at Rutgers University as a research faculty member. So Todd Clear, who was the dean at the time, made me the offer to join the faculty as a research faculty member, meaning that it wasn't tenure track. I happily accepted, spent a year there before transitioning over to my current tenured position at John Jay College.
Yeah, so let's move on to John Jay then. I have never been to John Jay College, so I'm kind of curious, just for those that have never been there before, to me, John Jay College of Criminal Justice is famous. I don't know if everybody else feels that way, but I have seen that on many publications, on many things that I've worked on as a law enforcement analyst. So just kind of describe John Jay for us.
Yeah, right. So, and I think the way to do this is to kind of talk about John Jay in the context of a higher education institution, right? So I'm fortunate to work at John Jay for a couple of reasons, right? Because one, not every university is concerned with their faculty doing research, right? Some universities are much more concerned with making sure you're in the classroom and teaching, and they have little concern about research productivity. John Jay encourages research, these types of partnerships with police, doing research that translates into practical application. John Jay really encourages their faculty to do that. So I'm really fortunate to be there, right? So that's the type of place John Jay is, right? It takes teaching, it takes education seriously, but it also takes research seriously. But the type of research it takes seriously fits very well with what I want to do. Because you have certain research universities that only care about the scientific rigor. They only care about the academic lessons that can be learned from research. And all of that is very important. And I like to think at least that a lot of my research falls into that bucket. But sometimes, right, as I started off speaking about, research that's valuable to police, right, are valuable to police because of the practical implications. And John Jay is also of that mindset, right? So John Jay is encouraging faculty not just to do research, but John Jay supports faculty who want to do research to have practical benefits too, in addition to just only the Ivy League or Ivy Tower, rather, type of academic research that other institutions emphasize.
Since you arrived at John Jay, then do you have a favorite project?
That's a really good question. Favorite project? I don't know. I mean, I think my favorite project is always the active project I'm working on, right? Because I select projects based upon what I'm currently interested in. Mm-hmm. So using that as a caveat, the one project that comes to mind is something that I've been working on for the last, we'll say, about 18 months. Myself and my colleague, Victoria Seitzma from Queen's University, we've been leading a project where we are looking at body camera footage of police use of force events in Newark, New Jersey. And we're essentially conducting what's referred to as a systematic social observation of that footage, right? So essentially we're looking at it, we're coding it, we're trying to learn as much as possible about each one of those events, right? So how often do police, for example, use de-escalation tactics? How often do police adhere to what we refer to in the literature as procedural justice? How often are suspects being aggressive towards the police, right? How often does it look like the suspect precipitated the event, right? So that's essentially what we've been working on and we've been writing up over the last year. We've been benefited by working with a couple of very talented PhD students from Rutgers University, Vijay Schiller, and I just realized that I'm maybe pronouncing his name incorrectly. Vijay, if you're listening to this, my apologies. And Nate Keneally from John Jay College, right, have been working really hard with us on this project. So that's my current favorite one, but probably only because it's the one that I'm currently actually writing about.
Yeah. When you said that, it made me laugh because I was like, well, does that mean all the projects that you work on don't end very well? And so this current one doesn't have an ending yet, so it's your favorite?
Maybe I haven't been disappointed by it yet. Yeah, probably. Actually, that's probably the real reason. I haven't had my heart broken by this project yet.
All right. Well, very good.
But I will. If the past is any indication, I will.
All right. Well, very good. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about key performance metrics, and then we'll get into some of your personal interests.
Perfect.
You're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Alder. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Stacy Belledin. As an aspiring crime analyst, I tried to find any training available to learn from classes, workshops, conferences, networking, you name it. If I could give one piece of advice, it is to invest in your future. I see many analysts sit out of training not to go to important conferences because their agency won't pay for it. And that happened to me too, but there's nothing that says you can't figure out how to get there on your own. Submit a presentation on your work, and you may find that some conferences will waive your registration. Buddy up in a hotel room to cut costs. Find local opportunities on online training where you don't have travel costs. Just like you budget for a vacation or a child's education, you should do the same for your continuing education. It's worth it.
Hi, I'm Jamie Roush, and I have a really important public service announcement for you. No one wants to hear your conversation on speakerphone in a public restroom. It's awkward for you and for anyone else who comes in. No conversation is that important.
Welcome back. Eric, I want to talk now about key performance metrics. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. We've talked about Compstat on this show quite often, and it amazes me when I think back to when I started Compstat and some of the metrics that were on that report going on 20 years ago. And it seems like those are the same metrics that they're still using today. I just did a quick Google search trying to find Compstat reports, and I found ones everywhere from 11 pages long to 90 pages long. But it all seemed like it was the same bean counting. It was the same part one crimes or calls for service counts or even response times, which it seems like there should be a better way to do business and that we should have key indicators that help police do a better job. And so I just leave the floor open to you, and we can take that wherever you want to take it.
So one time, a police chief in a large American city and I were speaking, right? And he said something that stuck with me, right, for ever since that conversation happened, right? And this was probably about 12 years ago. And this police chief said that Compstat was created to solve a problem in policing that doesn't exist anymore. And what he meant was, in 1994 or whenever the first Compstat meeting was created in the NYPD, the biannual UCR reports that police agencies would fill out to the FBI that was the only time agencies were able to take a look at crime trends in their city. So Compstat's innovation in the early 90s was creating processes to allow for quickly collecting data and quickly analyzing data and getting all of the decision makers together to discuss what to do about these crime trends in a data informed way, right? So that's innovation, right? I don't want to, kind of belittle Compstat and suggest that that wasn't innovative, right? I mean, that was an important turning point in the history of policing. The problem is too many agencies are looking at the same exact performance metrics that policing was looking at in the early 90s. Things that are easy to count, right? Arrests are counted in records management systems, so it's easy to count those. Tickets, citations, field interrogations, or we call those stop, question, frisk over here in New York. Response time, all of these things are collected on a regular basis, so they're easy to report. The problem is, there's an old saying, I think, that originated in the business literature that's creeped over to policing is what gets measured gets done. If we're holding people accountable for what we can measure and we're measuring things like arrest and citations, the cops are going to go out there and try to arrest people and give citations as much as possible. The problem is, for a lot of public safety problems, you can't arrest or cite your way out of it. I would even contend that for certain cases, an arrest, that doesn't mean a positive police outcome, right? So there's this one thought experiment I do with all of my students in my policy class, right, where I give two scenarios, right? I say, all right, let's say we have one bar and there's a rowdy couple of people, there's arguments going on, and it looks like they're about to start slugging it out. The bar manager calls the police come, they calm everyone down, they break everyone up, and they send everyone home, right? No one gets hurt. Now, let's say we have a second bar where we have the same situation, right? Bar manager calls the police come in, they get aggressive with everyone, they don't break anything up, right? One guy hits another guy over the head with a beer bottle, chaos ensues, the police make 4 arrests, right? Which one was the better policing job, right? I have yet to have any student tell me that it wasn't the first, right? They always say, yeah, well, the first ones, right? They prevented a crime, right? They prevented a crime. The problem is we can't measure that easily, right? Nothing happened, right? The police respond back to dispatch that it was handled by officer or whatever. There's no actionable metric. We can measure the heck out of the second one, right? We can measure how many arrests happened. We can measure how quickly the cops got there. I would argue, though, that those metrics may not be actually promoting good policing, right? And that's the danger in getting in this metric mindset, especially when we're using the same metrics we used 30 years ago.
And to your point, I was in a Baltimore Compstat once where one of the deputy commissioners was berating one of the majors because at a certain shift on a certain day, they only had 7 field interview reports, like you mentioned, basically saying that they needed to get into the game. That was the message. You should be doing more than 7 in that shift, that they weren't doing their job because they only did 7 or 8 in that shift.
Yeah, and that's an issue, right? Especially today, right? When we're having discussions about reimagining policing and we're having debates about whether or not we need to pull back policing in certain respects. I will argue till I'm blue in the face that effective policing, right, can accomplish both things at the same time. We can reduce crime and foster positive community relations simultaneously, right? But that argument goes out of the window if we're kind of emphasizing that cops need to put handcuffs as people as much as possible, right? Even if we're not explicitly saying that, if that's the metric that we're using to define whether or not a given officer is doing his or her job, right? And that can have very damaging consequences, right? Not to mention that research shows that we don't necessarily have to be aggressive to reduce crime, right? In fact, right, some of the most aggressive police actions and criminal justice actions don't actually have a tremendous amount of research evidence supporting them as wise crime prevention tools.
I think there would be police chiefs out there willing to do better indicators. Is it just that they haven't found them? Are there academics out there that have created metrics that are just being ignored? Because there is a ton of research going on, as you know, and as you described, there's a ton of research out there. And it seems to me on the academic side, they would have created some better key indicators by now as well.
Yeah, right. I mean, the short answer or long answer rather is that, right? I mean, we do understand things like community sentiment is important. Maybe that means that police agencies should try to do scientifically sound surveys of their citizens more often, right? So all of those make sense, right? But that would require police kind of generating this brand new source of data for them to analyze, right? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that in policing. However, I would contend that given the vast expansion of technology in policing, we have incredibly rich sources of data that can tell us quite a bit about officer performance that we're not taking advantage of as often as we need to, right? So I mentioned the body camera project that we're currently working on, right? Just from sitting down and watching that information, right? We could identify the percentage of events where police officers adhere to procedural justice. We could identify the number of events where maybe officers didn't do a great job of responding to citizen complaints or requests, right? So the quote unquote performance of officers is readily contained within that information, right? Same thing with stuff like automated vehicle locators, right? A lot of police departments around the country are now equipping their police vehicles with GPS sensors so that we could track exactly where they're at. Well, right, if you have a hotspot and you can show through AVL data that officers are spending sufficient amount of times in that hotspot, I would contend that you should stop the inquiry there, right? If we can show that cops are actually going where they're needed, we probably shouldn't care whether they locked anyone up that given day, right? Because research shows that mere police presence can be enough to deter offending, right? Now, I'm not saying that there's never going to be reasons for arrest, right? I'm not contending that there's never legitimate reasons for even arrests to increase from time to time, but there's no reason for that to be the benchmark. We have all of this technology which can tell us a whole lot about police activity and police performance that I think we need to figure out how to leverage a little bit better in policing.
Yeah. Well, with the AVL, I can think of a way where that could be automatically generated.
Yeah.
That could be part of a computer process in which you get a report daily on the percentage in a particular spot in the city and how much time the police car was in that spot. I mean, that's something that could be generated systematically, I believe. Back to the camera.
It certainly seems possible, right? It certainly seems possible.
Back to the camera, though, the body camera, though, that gets to pretty subjective types, right? You're talking about looking at the camera, making a decision, coming up with, did they follow procedure? Did they not follow procedure? That is a lot of qualitative data that needs to be collected before it can be reported on. So that would take a lot longer to generate.
And that's the challenge with that, right? So my colleagues and I, right, we've kind of come around to the opinion that every police department needs to build in some kind of capacity to proactively monitor or proactively review body camera footage, right? Far too often, police departments wait for something bad to happen, citizen complaint, use of force event. They wait for those things to happen before they review footage. We're of the opinion that you need to, get ahead of it a little bit more, which more police departments are doing. But we're mindful of the fact that police have a host of other things to take care of, mm-hmm. Right? We're researchers. We get paid for a living to do research. So, we're available to commit that amount of time to review this. Police are oftentimes not able to dedicate the necessary resources, right? But if we could figure out, I don't know, maybe machine learning applications, maybe you don't have to review all of the events, right? Maybe using machine learning again, maybe if you could identify every event where a piece of profanity was used, You could just look at those events to make sure that the police officers weren't in any violation of anything. I don't know, right? It seems to be that this is at least something we could work towards. I'm not claiming it'll be easy to figure out, but I'm a little bit more optimistic that this is a solvable problem.
Yeah, it would be nice if the citizens would give some unbiased survey results, right? Basically, it's going to be whether you got a ticket or not is how that's going to determine what the positive or negative survey results, right? But that would at least be something, again, that could be collected right away. That's a system, right? Because you're right. I feel that whatever metric that we could come up with, there has to be something in place where it gets automated and generated. If it's going to be something where it's going to take a lot of effort to get the report on executives' desks, it's going to be a tough hill to climb.
Yeah, and this is also why I think crime analysts are so important, right? Because it's probably going to take the work of crime analysts to figure out how to apply algorithms to these types of data sources, and how to quickly and efficiently crunch the data and make sense of it in a way that has implications for practice, right? It's going to take those efforts. And, I've personally come across a host of incredibly talented crime analysts around the country, right? And I think we may have the capacity in the profession to help move us towards that. I would like to see Compstat processes focus a little bit more about understanding underlying problems, right? Rather than, all right, this sector had an decrease in crime. Here are the arrests that happened in this sector. I would like to see those type of venues support a little bit more dialogue and analysis meant to get at the underlying situational factors that are responsible for making high crime areas high crime, right? And speaking a little bit more towards, all right, what should police do specifically about these situational problems that they maybe are not currently doing?
Yeah. And it is interesting. I've said this a couple of times on this show. I think some hesitancy from some departments to get into problem solving policing is it gets out of their area of control. When you talk about Compstat, you talked about stuff that gets measured. That's stuff that's tangible. They can react to it. They can build a plan to it. They are totally in control of that meeting and everybody essentially in that room. When you get into problem-oriented policing, you get into a lot of departments outside of the police department and a lot of different stakeholders, and it becomes a brand new ball game because you are no longer fully in control of the meeting and the situation.
That makes sense, right? And there's probably a lot of truth to that. I also think, however, it may just be, I think another potentially contributing factor is just a lack of education on what we mean by problem-oriented policing and what do things like evidence-based policing mean, right? Police training, right, is too detached from scientific evidence on effectiveness, in my opinion, right? Right, we send cops to the police academy, right? We want them to know legal requirements. We want them to demonstrate their physical fitness to be a police officer, right? Even things like sergeant or captain's exams, right? We're primarily testing people under knowledge of the law. What makes effective police practice, right, is very detached from the hiring and promotion process of police agencies in this country, right? One thing I remember, actually, one of my first command staff meetings that I attended when I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed analyst in Newark, New Jersey, right? The term problem-oriented policing came up, right? And I forget who said it. I think it was in the context of one of the police director's prior statements. The police director wasn't at this specific meeting. And one of the captains actually said, right, oh, what's problem-oriented policing? I've never heard that term. And one of the deputy chiefs in the room said, I think that's when the academics tell us what to do, right? And everyone had a nice little laugh and moved on. But that showed that, right? I mean, problem-oriented policing is a term that academics like myself have been slinging around since the 80s, right? Uh-huh. And here we had a major police department and no one really heard of the phrase before. And the one person who did know the phrase had a very negative view of it. Now, part of that is academia's fault, right? I mean, part of that is probably academics talking at officers rather than talking with officers too often. But I think it also shows just an education deficit, right? I mean, we're not training police officers or police leaders in evidence-based practice, right? So it's far too often a foreign concept in police agencies.
I definitely would want to see more being done with these metrics. And I've often thought that even associations like IACA and IALEA, could be an awesome way to contribute and to find, maybe even finance research specifically to try to improve the Compstat process, or just even if it's not Compstat, or just more key metrics, key indicators that could help, because it certainly is lacking. And there seems to be plenty of opportunity to come up with metrics that could help police executives make better decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? And I think kind of this relates to kind of a broader theme that I've been writing a lot about over the last several years, is that I think crime analysts need to be more involved in evaluation efforts as well, right? And I think this notion of program or performance metrics rather relates to that. Right? So we leverage crime analysts to analyze data for the purpose of identifying problems. Police agencies take those findings provided by crime analysts and design interventions around them. And then when the time comes to figure out if the intervention works, for some reason, the crime analysts are completely blocked from that process, right? Most interventions aren't evaluated, right? To be perfectly frank, most day-to-day police operations, police don't take the effort to figure out whether or not it's succeeding in reducing crime. The common model is to go to outside academics like myself and get assistance in evaluating whether or not a given intervention worked. Crime analysts are on the sidelines too often in those types of efforts, right? I think policing would benefit greatly from crime analysts receiving more training on scientific evaluations of police efforts, right? So when the time comes to figure out whether or not police are getting the benefit of their interventions, they can go a little bit more in-house to answer those types of questions.
And now analysts do that, right? It's that crime trend is over, on to the next one, and without getting into a lot of the problem solving, or that's not part of their job. That's a different unit's job doing the problem solving, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And so, that's a good call to be better at research and have an understanding of how to test if something was successful. I know that was one of my shortcomings when I was an analyst.
Yeah, and I think, right, I think most analysts have the technological skills where they could be trained to start answering those types of questions for police departments, right? I mean, again, that's something I'm optimistic on, that if a little bit more resources were dedicated to preparing analysts for those types of functions, they could start being responsible for those types of functions.
Well, let's move on. I do want to talk about your new book, Modern Policing Using ArcGIS Pro, which, as I mentioned to you yesterday, Esri probably loves that title. And so just to tell us a little bit about the book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, certainly. So ArcGIS Pro is the new Esri product. So Esri's legacy software, ArcMap or ArcGIS, whatever you want to refer to it as, is going away, right? So the last version of the software will be the last version of the software supported. And then it's going to be ArcGIS Pro as the only option. So a few years ago, when I was kind of doing some training on behalf of the Division of Criminal Justice Services in New York State, specifically partnering with Anthony D'Abrazo on that effort, who leads the training coordination for that agency. Right, we kind of started discussing ArcGIS Pro as the only game in town, and how prepared our analysts going to be to transition to this software. And over time, after meeting with analysts, after teaching these types of classes with analysts, I just started kind of writing down the lessons in a little bit more formal manner. And then I invited my colleague, Jonas Balkman, who's a co-author on the book, who was similarly involved in training analysts in ArcGIS Pro in Kansas City, where he's a police captain. And we just, kind of formally put together the book idea and then submitted the proposal to Esri Press. And Esri was very supportive, right? They, essentially signed us to a formal book contract, and essentially that's how the book came about, right? So what we're hoping is that crime analysts can use the book to either prepare their transition from the legacy ArcGIS software to Arc Pro, or if they've already started working in Arc Pro, they could look to the book as a resource to get even more comfortable and to really center all of their crime analysis and crime mapping functions around the software, right? So essentially that was the goal for the book. And now that the book is out there in the world, that's how we're hoping analysts are able to use it.
Okay. So does the book just point out the differences between ArcGIS and ArcGIS Pro, or is it more of a recipe book where it's going to show you step by step of how you get where you need to go?
It's a recipe book. I never heard anyone use that term, but I love it, right? So it is more of a recipe book, right? Where the chapters are structured in a way where we begin each chapter with either a research highlight, which essentially where we talk about a place-based policing piece of research, and we talk about the analysis and why it's important to do that type of analysis. And then the rest of the chapter kind of walks you through the step of doing that type of analysis in ArcGIS Pro. We also have crime analysis highlights, where crime analysts from around North America actually give us a little, for lack of a better term, war story about a problem that they were facing in their agency and how they used crime mapping to help understand the problem better and to help hopefully solve the problem. And then again, the subsequent exercises in the chapter walks the reader through how to do that type of analysis in ArcGIS Pro. So it's very hands-on. It uses real crime data that's publicly available and provided as part of the book. So essentially that's the main structure of the book. It's very hands-on. It's not very theoretical or conceptual, right? Like we really want the readers to get their hands dirty and work with real world data. And we try to walk them through that in each one of the chapters.
Very good. Well, congratulations on the book. And we'll be
Thank
sure
you.
to put a link to where you can purchase the book in the show notes.
Thank you.
All right, Eric, let's finish up with some personal interests. You are a craft beer enthusiast. So when I hear someone say, "Hey, I'm into craft beers," my first question is, do you like IPA or you don't like IPA?
I'm not a big IPA guy. IPA guy.
Well, that makes two of us. So we're good so far.
Though I had a very good oats IPA at Industrial Arts Brewery in Beacon, New York, a couple of weekends ago. Shout out to my colleague, Kevin Wolf, another John Jay professor, for taking me there. That was a particularly good IPA.
And then, so what do you normally go for in terms of craft beers?
Craft beers, I'm like an amber ale, brown ale kind of guy, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of those beers kind of speak to my palate. But to be honest, I'm not very discriminatory. I also enjoy the occasional stouts. Like there's been a lot of like bourbon-based stouts that have come out over the last few years, and I'm kind of a big whiskey guy as well. So those speak to me as well.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite right now?
So my favorite, hard to say, right? Hard to say, actually. So there's a brewery in South Jersey called Beach House Brewery, and they have a couple of really good bourbon stouts, right? So I think those are probably leading the race now.
Interesting. I know I've never had a bourbon stout before, so I'll have to put that on the checklist. So. All right. And then your wife is into animal rescue, which is a noble cause. And
yes.
So do you want to describe that program?
Yeah, so essentially, when I'm not doing funded research projects on my own time, I'm doing research for free. That's my real hobby. But then when I'm not doing research for free, I'm assisting my wife in her animal rescue efforts. So and ever since I've known her, right, so my wife and I, we've been together for about 18 years now. So she's been involved very heavily in animal rescue. Started off as kind of a small operation when we first started dating, right? I mean, out of our, kind of apartment, she would have the occasional cat that she would try to find a home for. Now she has her own official nonprofit organization called That's Animals. So she dedicates most of her time to that kind of large scale animal welfare operations. And I assist her very minimally. I mean, she does the heavy lifting for sure, right? But I assist her in running that organization as well, right? So that also takes up quite a bit of my time.
All right. Well, our last segment of the show is Words to the World, and this is where I give the guest the last word. Eric, you can promote any idea that you wish. What are your words to the world?
So crime analysis is no longer a luxury for police departments, despite the tendency for too many police departments to treat it as a luxury, right? To do effective evidence-based policing, to stay on the cutting edge of what works, you need strong crime analysis capabilities. And I think crime analysts need to be more mindful of that, right? If you're describing your job as you're quote unquote crunching numbers, or you're quote unquote printing out reports for the leadership, you're underselling yourself, right? Crime analysis is the driver of innovation in policing. It has been over the last couple of decades, and I think it will continue to be moving forward.
Very good. Well, I leave every guest with you. You've given me just enough to talk bad about you later.
Yes.
But I do appreciate you being on the show, Eric. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Alder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to the Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.